Undercover owner finds employee tied to a chair. What happens next is heartbreaking. Mr. John, you have to go. Please, they'll be back. They'll find you. Milo's terrified whisper cut through the dusty air of the prop room, his eyes wide as Jackson frantically worked at his bonds. Who, Milo? Who did this? Jackson demanded, his undercover investigation taking a horrifying turn. What dark secrets did the Roxford Theater hold? To hear the full, gripping story of bravery, betrayal, and the fight for justice, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and tune in for the complete tale. You won't want to miss what happens next. The air in the old prop room was thick with the smell of dust, decaying fabric, and something else. Fear. Jackson Reeve, his face grimy with stage makeup, he hadn't bothered to fully remove his borrowed overalls, smelling faintly of sweat and paint, fumbled with the cheap lockpick he'd lifted from a maintenance toolbox. The tumblers finally clicked. He eased the door open a crack. Darkness. Then a muffled sob, a desperate rhythmic thumping. He slipped inside his heart, hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His eyes, adjusting slowly, made out a shape slumped in the center of the room, illuminated by a sliver of moonlight from a grimy, boarded-up window. A chair, and tied to it, a young man. Milo, the quiet 17-year-old intern Jackson had seen scurrying backstage, always eager to please, always looking slightly haunted. Milo's eyes, wide and reflecting the scant light, found Jackson's. They were filled with a raw animal terror. A thick strip of gaffer tape silenced his mouth. His thin arms were bound cruelly behind the chair with what looked like electrical cable, his legs similarly secured to its rungs. He was straining against the bonds, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. Jackson rushed forward, his mind reeling. "Milo," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He began to work on the tape, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline. As the tape came away, Milo gasped, a choked cry escaping him. "Mr. John, you have to go. Please, they'll be back. They'll find you." His voice was a raw, terrified whisper. He was trembling violently, his gaze darting towards the door. "Who, Milo? Who did this?" Jackson demanded, his hands moving to the cables on the boy's wrists. Before Milo could answer, the door creaked open wider. A tall, imposing silhouette filled the doorway, backlit by the dim hallway light. Gregory Lane, the Roxford Theater's charismatic, imperious, artistic director, stepped into the room. He didn't seem surprised. His expression was cold, almost bored. "Well, well," Milo Gregory said, his voice smooth as poisoned honey. "Still trying to cause trouble, are we? I thought we had an understanding." He glanced dismissively at Jackson, still disguised as John Smith, the new nondescript maintenance hire, and you, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Get out! Milo flinched, a fresh wave of terror washing over his face. He knows," Milo stammered, looking at Gregory with a mixture of defiance and dread. He saw the other ledger. Gregory's eyes, already cold, seemed to turn to ice. He took a slow step further into the room. "Ledger. What ledger would that be, Milo? Perhaps you're confused. Perhaps the stress is getting to you." He smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. "Some people just don't learn their lesson the easy way." Jackson felt a surge of cold fury. He positioned himself slightly in front of Milo. This wasn't just about missing funds anymore. This was something monstrous. The air crackled with unspoken violence. Jackson knew with sickening certainty that his undercover investigation had just taken a desperately dangerous turn. The truth was far uglier and far more brutal than he could have ever imagined. 6 weeks earlier, Jackson Reeve, 38, had been just another name on a list of affluent New Yorkers, albeit one with a more eclectic portfolio than most. He owned a string of boutique hotels, a moderately successful tech startup, and his most cherished and frustrating asset, the Roxford Theater. The Roxford, a grand old dame of a playhouse, nestled in a gentrifying but still gritty neighborhood on the city's edge, was a legacy from his beloved grandfather, a man who believed in the transformative power of art for the community. Jackson shared that belief, but lately the Roxford was transforming his patients into a knot of anxiety. Profits were inexplicably down. This, despite consistently good attendance figures, glowing reviews for its innovative community outreach programs, and what seemed to be generous donor support. Arthur Grimwald, the theater's general manager for nearly 2 decades, a man his grandfather had trusted implicitly, offered quarterly reports filled with convoluted explanations about rising overheads, unexpected maintenance, and shifting audience demographics. Jackson, more an intuitive businessman than a forensic accountant, felt a persistent, nagging dissonance. The numbers told one story. The theater's vibrant energy when he occasionally visited told another. His executive assistant, Diana Hayes, a woman whose sharp intellect was matched only by her sharper wit, had been blunt. The books are cooked or Grimwald's a fool. Probably both, she'd said, reviewing the latest disappointing financials. You fly in, make a speech at the annual gala, sign some checks, and fly out. You're an absentee landlord, Jackson. If you care about this place, really care, you need to get your hands dirty. Her words stung because they were true. His other ventures demanded his attention, and he'd allowed himself to become detached from the Roxford's daily pulse. His grandfather wouldn't have. So Jackson made a decision that made Diana raise a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. He wasn't going to send in auditors, not yet. He was going in himself. Undercover. He invented a distant cousin, John Smith, a man down on his luck, looking for any kind of work. A few subtle changes, letting his normally sharp haircut grow out, cultivating a few days' stubble, trading his bespoke suits for worn jeans and faded T-shirts, and affecting a slightly slumped, world-weary posture, rendered him surprisingly anonymous. He told Diana he was taking an extended off-grid sabbatical to clear his head, confiding the truth only to her. She was his sole link to his real life, his emergency contact. John Smith applied for a recently vacated custodial and general maintenance position at the Roxford. The interview with Martha Jenkins, the perpetually flustered head of operations, was brief. She seemed more interested in his willingness to work odd hours for minimum wage than in his non-existent references. He was hired. The Roxford from the inside was a revelation. Its faded velvet seats and dusty chandeliers whispered of past glories, but the energy backstage was a mix of creative fervor and simmering stress. The crew, stagehands, costumers, lighting techs, were passionate and hard-working, but stretched thin. Whispers about budget cuts were constant, a stark contrast to the lavish new sets commissioned by Gregory Lane, the artistic director. Lane was a force of nature, undeniably talented, flamboyant, and possessed of a volcanic temper. He commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Martha Jenkins, for all her title, seemed utterly incapable of managing him. She scurried in his wake, wringing her hands. And then there was Milo, a 17-year-old intern, quiet and observant, always with a sketchbook or a script in hand. He did odd jobs, fetching coffee, running errands, helping paint scenery, with a diligence that was almost painful to watch. Jackson, as John had noticed, the boy often looked tired, anxious, especially when Gregory Lane was nearby. There was an unusually high turnover of junior staff, Jackson learned. People just left. He'd started noticing small discrepancies, orders for cleaning supplies that never seemed to fully arrive, petty cash vouchers for sundries that were suspiciously vague. Nothing definitive, just a collection of small discordant notes in the theater's daily symphony. He'd felt like he was chasing shadows until that night, the night the shadows reached out and grabbed a terrified boy in the dark. For 3 weeks, Jackson, as John Smith, had swept floors, cleaned toilets, and hauled equipment, his eyes and ears open. He observed the ecosystem of the Roxford, the hushed reverence, when Gregory Lane outlined a new artistic vision, the casual cruelty. When Gregory berated a young actor for a missed cue, Martha Jenkins' fluttering attempts to placate everyone, and the underlying hum of financial anxiety that seemed to permeate every department except, it appeared, Gregory's own. He'd overheard snippets of conversations that pricked his attention. 2 young stage hands muttering about how lucky Sarah from costumes was to have found another job so quickly after that run-in with Lane, and how strange it was she hadn't even collected her last paycheck. He saw Milo flinch when Gregory's booming laugh echoed down a corridor, even when it wasn't directed at him. The boy was becoming increasingly withdrawn, his earlier shy eagerness replaced by a hunted look. Jackson noted Milo particularly avoided the old, seldom-used prop storage room in the theater's labyrinthine basement, a space Gregory had claimed for special projects and kept locked. The inciting incident began not with a bang, but with a barely audible scrape. Jackson was supposed to be finishing a late-night cleaning rota, a task Martha had assigned him, with a sigh implying it was punishment for some unspecified minor infraction. Earlier in the week, he suspected Gregory had complained about John being too slow. The theater was mostly deserted, the distant hum of the main street traffic a counterpoint to the vast, echoing silence of the empty auditorium. As he was about to lock up the maintenance office, he heard it, a distinct, rhythmic thumping, followed by what sounded like a muffled cry, coming from the direction of the old prop room. A cold unease, an unwelcome echo of the vague suspicions he'd been collecting settled over him. Gregory was supposedly at a schmoozing event downtown. Martha had left hours ago. Who would be in that locked room? His grandfather had been a dab hand at practical things, and some of that had rubbed off. Jackson remembered a small, rarely used ring of master keys for the older locks kept in a dusty box in the back of the very office he was in. He found them. His hand was surprisingly steady as he sorted through them, then headed towards the basement. The prop room door was as expected locked. The third key he tried turned with a reluctant click. He pushed the door inward. The scene that greeted him, Milo-bound, gagged eyes wild with terror, burned itself into his memory. This was the hook, the horrifying discovery now anchored in the preceding weeks of his quiet, undercover observation. The vague unease had coalesced into a monstrous certainty something was deeply, terribly wrong at the Roxford. His initial reaction was a confusing rush shock at the brutality, a protective surge of anger towards the unseen perpetrator, and a sudden chilling awareness of his own precarious position. He was John Smith, the nobody janitor. What power did he have here? He instinctively pulled out the cheap burner phone he used for his undercover persona, and shielding it with his body, quickly snapped 2 photos of Milo before rushing to the boy's side. "Milo?" he'd whispered, tearing at the gaffer tape. The boy's subsequent terrified warning, "Mr. John, you have to go. Please, they'll be back," confirmed his worst fears. And then Gregory Lane had appeared, his entrance dripping with menace, his words to Milo laced with a chilling possessiveness. When Milo in his fear blurted out, He knows," he saw the other ledger. Gregory's mask of urbane charm had slipped, revealing the predator beneath. Before Jackson could formulate a response, before Gregory could escalate whatever punishment he had in mind, the distant clang of a fire door opening and the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. It was Dave, the night security guard, doing his rounds. Gregory's expression flickered. He straightened up, his demeanor shifting instantly. "Milo, you look unwell. Perhaps you should go home," he said, his voice now laced with false concern. He shot Jackson a look that promised retribution. "And you, finish your work. Don't be late again." He swept out of the room just as Dave's flashlight beam appeared at the end of the hall. Jackson quickly untied Milo, his mind racing. The boy was shaking uncontrollably. "We need to call the police," Milo, Jackson urged. Milo shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. "No, please, you don't understand. He'll hurt my mom. She works here. He'll say I'm lying. No one will believe me. Please, Mr. John, just pretend you didn't see anything. Please." Jackson felt a wave of frustration and helplessness, but looking at the sheer terror in Milo's eyes, he knew he couldn't force him. Not yet. His immediate goal crystallized: protect Milo. His secondary goal burning with a new urgency: find out what was in that other ledger and expose Gregory Lane for the monster he clearly was. His undercover mission had just become infinitely more complex and infinitely more dangerous. He was no longer just observing, he was now inextricably involved. The days following the prop room incident were fraught with a new palpable tension. Jackson, outwardly John Smith, the janitor, was inwardly a coiled spring of anger and apprehension. He tried to speak to Milo privately, but the boy was a ghost flitting through the backstage corridors, his eyes downcast, avoiding Jackson at every turn. The terror Gregory had instilled was a suffocating blanket. Jackson knew he couldn't push too hard too fast. He focused on observing Gregory, whose arrogance seemed to have grown now that he believed he'd thoroughly intimidated Milo. Gregory was often seen in hushed, intense conversations with a sharply dressed, unfamiliar man who carried an expensive briefcase and had the predatory stillness of a shark. These meetings usually took place in Gregory's private office, the one Milo had mentioned in connection with the other ledger. Accessing theater financial records directly proved impossible. Martha Jenkins, when Jackson casually inquired about some misfiled invoices as a pretext, became flustered and defensive, reiterating that all financial matters were handled by Mr. Grimwald and Mr. Lane. Her loyalty, or perhaps her fear, was a solid wall. A significant complication arose in the form of Elena Milo's mother, a quiet, hard-working woman who ran the Roxford small box office. She was fiercely protective of her son. Seeing Milo's increased distress and noticing John Smith attempting to speak with him, she cornered Jackson one afternoon. "Leave my son alone," she said, her voice low but firm. "He's a good boy, but he's sensitive. Whatever you think you're doing, you're upsetting him. Stay away from him." This maternal protectiveness, while understandable, effectively cut off Jackson's easiest line of communication with Milo. Jackson turned to Diana, his lifeline. From her remote office, she began a discreet digital investigation into Laneway Productions, a name Jackson had overheard Gregory mention to the shark-like man. Diana's initial findings were telling Laneway Productions was a registered LLC with Gregory Lane as its sole director. It had no website, no listed phone number beyond a registered agent service, and its address was a mail drop. Classic shell company, finally a breakthrough. Jackson, leveraging his janitorial access, managed to accidentally be cleaning the narrow hallway outside Gregory's office when Milo was summoned inside. He heard Gregory's raised voice, then Milo's quiet, fearful responses. After Milo scurried out, looking paler than ever, Jackson found an opportunity to approach him in a deserted stairwell. "Milo," he said gently, "I know you're scared, but what Gregory is doing, it's not just wrong, it's dangerous. He hurt you. He can't be allowed to get away with it." This time, something in Jackson's quiet intensity, or perhaps Milo's own desperation, broke through. Tears welling, Milo confessed. Weeks ago, while looking for a specific prop Gregory had demanded, he'd stumbled into Gregory's unlocked office. He'd seen an unfamiliar leather-bound ledger on the desk, different from the official account books. Curiosity piqued by overheard whispers of financial irregularities, he'd glanced inside. It was filled with figures' names and transfers related to the Roxford Youth Talent Fund, a scholarship program the theater prided itself on. The amounts being diverted to Laneway Productions for services rendered were staggering. He'd panicked, but with a burst of reckless courage had quickly copied a few pages of entries into a small, cheap notebook he always carried before Gregory returned unexpectedly. Gregory had eventually realized Milo had seen something leading to the brutal interrogation and imprisonment in the prop room. Milo, terrified, had hidden his notebook deep within the rarely accessed organ loft of the main auditorium. Gregory, however, was no fool. He noticed John Smith's continued presence the way the janitor sometimes seemed to be watching, listening. He noticed Milo's brief, furtive conversation with John in the stairwell. His demeanor towards Jackson shifted from dismissive contempt to active suspicion. John found himself assigned the grimmiest, most isolating tasks, cleaning out blocked drains in the ancient sub-basement, sorting through decades of forgotten rat-infested costumes. Veiled threats began to color Gregory's instructions. "Some people are better off keeping their heads down and their mouths shut, Smith. This theater has a way of discarding what's no longer useful." Jackson, with Diana's help, managed to track down the costume assistant, Sarah, who had quit suddenly. She was now waitressing in a small town upstate, clearly still frightened. It took Diana's most persuasive skills and a promise of anonymity. But Sarah finally agreed to speak to a private investigator, Diana's cover, about Gregory's bullying, his inappropriate financial requests, using her name for small expense reports, and the veiled threats that had made her flee. The pressure was mounting. Jackson knew he needed Milo's notebook. It was the most concrete piece of evidence they had against Gregory's internal machinations. But Milo was petrified of retrieving it, convinced Gregory would be watching his every move. A glimmer of hope came from an unexpected quarter. Old Ben, the theater's veteran stage manager, a man who had seen countless directors and dramas come and go, had always been gruff but fair with John, Jackson, taking a gamble, confided a heavily edited version of his concerns to Ben, that he suspected financial misconduct and that Milo was being unfairly targeted. Ben listened, his weathered face unreadable. Then he grunted, "Lane's a bastard, always has been. Got an ego bigger than the main stage and hands too quick with the petty cash." He didn't offer help directly, but the next day Jackson found a master schematic of the theater's older electrical and access conduits accidentally left on a workbench, along with a note, "Organ loft access panel sometimes sticks. Needs oil." It was a subtle, deniable lifeline. The stakes were clear. Gregory was not just a bully or a petty thief. He was ruthless and growing more suspicious. Jackson had to get that notebook, protect Milo, and find a way to bring the entire corrupt edifice crashing down before Gregory crushed them first. The organ loft. Milo's description had been precise. Behind a loose panel at the back of the colossal, rarely used instrument, nestled amongst dusty pipes and forgotten scores, lay his notebook. Retrieving it felt like planning a heist. Jackson, studying Ben's schematics, realized the loft was most accessible during the chaotic pre-show setup for the Roxford's current moderately successful production, a period when backstage was a controlled frenzy of activity, and Gregory was usually preoccupied with tormenting the actors. The plan was simple, or so Jackson hoped. He, as John, would create a diversion, a faulty circuit breaker controlling some non-essential backstage lighting, something that would draw attention and require Martha or a senior tech to investigate. During that window of distraction, Milo, feigning an errand to fetch a forgotten script from an adjacent storage area, would slip into the organ loft. The day of the attempt, the air backstage crackled with more than the usual pre-show nerves. Jackson could feel Gregory's eyes on him more often, a cold, calculating gaze that made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. Milo was pale, but determined, clutching a tattered copy of Hamlet as his prop. Jackson, after ensuring Gregory was deep in a heated discussion with the lead actress, located the designated circuit breaker panel. He took a breath, then, using insulated pliers, carefully jiggled the breaker until it tripped, plunging a section of the backstage corridor into semi-darkness. Shouts of surprise and annoyance immediately followed. Perfect. He saw Martha Jenkins hurrying towards the panel, her face a mask of exasperation. He caught Milo's eye across the crowded backstage area and gave a barely perceptible nod. Milo, looking smaller and younger than ever, slipped away towards the stairwell leading to the upper balconies and the organ loft. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Jackson busied himself assisting a flustered lighting technician, all the while straining his ears for any unusual sounds from above. Then a muffled cry, quickly cut off. Not a cry of success. Jackson's blood ran cold. He muttered an excuse and sprinted towards the stairwell, his John Smith persona forgotten. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding. As he reached the small landing outside the organ loft, the door was flung open. Gregory Lane stood there, his face contorted in a mask of fury. He had Milo by the arm, twisting it cruelly. In his other hand, Gregory held the small, cheap notebook. Martha Jenkins hovered behind him, looking horrified but making no move to intervene. "Looking for this, Smith?" Gregory snarled, shaking the notebook in Jackson's face. He clearly hadn't connected John Smith to Jackson Reeve yet, but he recognized an enemy. Or should I say, whoever the hell you really are, I knew you were trouble. Snooping, whispering with this little rat. He tightened his grip on Milo's arm, making the boy cry out in pain. "Let him go." Lane Jackson said, his voice dangerously quiet. All pretense was gone. Or what Gregory sneered, "You'll sweep me to death. You and this little thief have been poking your noses into my business." "Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" He gestured with the notebook. "Fabrications, lies. No one will believe a word from a fired janitor and a delinquent kid." In that moment, Jackson knew his quiet investigation was over. He had to act. The Roxford Youth Talent Fund? Gregory Jackson said, his voice ringing with an authority that made Gregory pause for a split second. "The hundreds of thousands you've siphoned into Laneway Productions. That's not a fabrication." Gregory's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, then narrowed. "You know nothing." He shoved Milo towards Martha. "Take him to my office and call security. Get this piece of trash out of my theater." But Jackson wasn't going to be escorted out. He lunged not for Gregory, but for the notebook. The move was unexpected. Gregory, surprised by the janitor's sudden aggression, stumbled back. Jackson snatched the notebook. For a moment, they were locked in a tense standoff. Then Gregory bellowed, "Security!" Now Jackson knew they had seconds. He grabbed Milo's other arm. "Run!" They half fell, half ran down the narrow stairs, bursting out into the disarray backstage. Stagehands and actors stared as John Smith, the janitor, practically dragged a terrified Milo towards the stage door, Gregory's furious roars echoing behind them. Two burly security guards, Gregory's loyal heavies, were already moving to intercept. Jackson, fueled by adrenaline, saw an opening. A large wheeled set piece, a Victorian facade, was partially blocking an exit. With a desperate shove, he sent it rolling. It crashed into the pursuing guards, creating a momentary barricade of chaos. He and Milo scrambled through the stage door and out into the relative anonymity of the evening street, the notebook clutched tightly in Jackson's hand. They didn't stop running for several blocks. Jackson's cover as John Smith was blown. Gregory now knew he possessed damning evidence and would be relentless. There was no going back to quiet observation. The game had changed. He had the proof, but he was now a target, and Milo, terrified but resolute, was in more danger than ever. The grimy alleyway several blocks from the Roxford offered a momentary, breathless sanctuary. Milo was shaking like a leaf, gulping air, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief at their chaotic escape. Jackson, his own heart still hammering, leaned against a brick wall, the small, precious notebook clutched in his hand. He knows Milo," whispered his voice cracking. "What are we going to do?" "My mom. I'll take care of your mom, Milo. I promise," Jackson said, trying to project a calm he didn't entirely feel. He pulled out his burner phone and called Diana. Code red. "We're out. He has the notebook. Need extraction and a secure location. Now." Diana, ever efficient, had a clean car and a discreetly rented apartment waiting for them within the hour. As Milo huddled under a blanket still trembling, Jackson and Diana spread the contents of Milo's notebook across a coffee table. The meticulously copied entries were damning. Dates, transfer amounts, and cryptic references painted a clear picture of systematic embezzlement from the Roxford Youth Talent Fund. Hundreds of thousands of dollars meant for scholarships, workshops, and mentorships for underprivileged youth had been funneled into Gregory Lane's shell company, Laneway Productions, under headings like talent scouting fees, program development consultancy, and specialized training materials, none of which Jackson knew had ever materialized in any tangible benefit to the theater's youth programs. A wave of cold anger, mixed with a profound sense of betrayal, washed over Jackson. This wasn't just about a corrupt artistic director. Arthur Grimwald, the man his grandfather had trusted, the general manager who oversaw all theater operations, had to be either deeply complicit or so criminally negligent as to be indistinguishable from it. This realization added a painful personal dimension to the financial crime. "Gregory won't take this lying down," Diana stated, her expression grim as she photographed each page of the notebook. "He knows John Smith has this. He'll try to discredit you, paint Milo as a liar, maybe even destroy the original ledgers if he hasn't already." Jackson nodded. "Which means John Smith needs to disappear, and Jackson Reeve needs to step up. But not yet. Not until we have more than just this notebook. Gregory's charismatic, well-connected. He'll try to spin this." Their new plan began to take shape. They needed to corroborate Milo's evidence, build an unshakable case, and find a way to present it that would bypass Gregory's influence and Grimwald's complicity. Diana's first task was to recontact Sarah, the former costume assistant. Armed with the specific details from Milo's notebook, and with Jackson's assurance conveyed through Diana that he was working to expose Gregory, Sarah reluctantly agreed to provide a sworn affidavit detailing Gregory's financial bullying and the climate of fear he cultivated. She even recalled seeing unfamiliar ledgers in his office. Next, Jackson, using Diana as an intermediary, began to carefully vet the Roxford's board of directors. He needed allies, or at least individuals, not entirely in Gregory and Grimwald's pockets. He identified 3 members who had occasionally voiced mild concerns about transparency or Lane's unchecked spending. Diana arranged discreet, off-the-record meetings where Jackson, still maintaining his distance, allowed her to share heavily redacted summaries of the evidence, gauging their reactions. 2 were cautiously interested. One seemed more alarmed by the potential scandal than the wrongdoing. It was a start. Milo, in the relative safety of the apartment, slowly began to recover his composure. As he talked, more details emerged. Overheard snippets of conversations between Gregory and Grimwald about handling the laneway transfers, specific dates when large sums were moved just before Gregory embarked on expensive research trips. He even remembered seeing a file labeled Laneway Contracts in Gregory's main office filing cabinet. The counteroffensive, when it came, was swift and insidious. Gregory, unable to locate John Smith or Milo, went on the attack. Rumors began circulating within the theater community. A disgruntled, recently fired maintenance worker named John Smith was attempting to blackmail Mr. Lane with fabricated accusations, manipulating a troubled young intern. Gregory, with Grimwald's backing, even approached Elena Milo's mother. He was all smooth concern, suggesting Milo was confused and impressionable, hinting that a public retraction from Milo would be beneficial for everyone, especially for Elena's continued employment at the Roxford. Elena was terrified and torn. She called Milo, her voice strained. Jackson, overhearing Milo's anguished attempts to reassure his mother, knew they had to shield them both. Diana arranged for Elena to take an emergency leave of absence due to a family matter, getting her away from the theater's toxic environment and Gregory's daily pressure. The new plan solidified. The upcoming annual Roxford Donor Gala, a glittering affair where Gregory was scheduled to announce a major expansion of the Youth Talent Fund, the very fund he was plundering, would be their stage. Jackson Reeve would make his return not as a distant owner, but as an avenger. They would present their evidence publicly, forcing the board and the authorities to act. It was high risk, but anything less would allow Gregory to wriggle free. The quiet investigation was over. A public confrontation was inevitable. The Roxford Donor Gala was less than a week away. It was Gregory Lane's night to shine to glad hand the city's philanthropic elite, and with a flourish of performative generosity, announced the ambitious and entirely fraudulent expansion of the Youth Talent Fund. For Jackson, it was the deadline, the point where all their frantic clandestine preparations had to converge. Through the two cautiously allied board members, Diana had managed to secure invitations to the gala for Jackson Reeve and guest. Gregory and Grimwald, still unaware of John Smith's true identity, would be expecting the theater's owner to make his usual brief, benign appearance. They had no idea he was bringing the key to their downfall as his +1 Milo. Gregory, however, wasn't idle. His inability to locate John Smith and Milo clearly unnerved him. One evening, as Jackson was leaving a strategy session at Diana's office, a neutral location, a nondescript car pulled up beside him. A heavy-set man leaned across the passenger seat. "Mr. Smith," he asked, his voice flat. "Mr. Lane doesn't appreciate employees who can't take a hint. Some things are best forgotten. For your own good." The car then sped off. The threat was clear, but also revealed Gregory was still operating under the assumption John was just a troublesome ex-employee. The pressure on Elena Milo's mother intensified. Gregory, through Martha Jenkins this time, dangled a significant promotion and a hefty discretionary bonus if Milo would just issue a statement saying he was confused and had misinterpreted things he'd seen. The alternative, Martha implied heavily, was not just Elena's job, but potential legal trouble for Milo for slander. This was Milo's darkest moment. He paced the small apartment torn apart by fear for his mother. "Maybe I should just tell them what they want to hear," he whispered to Jackson, his face pale with anguish. "I don't want her to get hurt because of me." Jackson sat with him, not pressuring, but laying out the stakes. "Gregory is a predator, Milo. If you back down now, he wins. He'll keep doing this to others. But it's your decision. Whatever you choose, I'll stand by you, and I'll do everything in my power to protect your mother." He also explained the legal safeguards they were trying to put in place. Slowly drawing on an inner strength Jackson had only glimpsed before Milo firmed his resolve. "No," he said, his voice shaking, but clear. "He doesn't get to win. I'll do it. I'll speak." When Elena heard of Milo's decision and of Jackson's quiet assurances, her own doubts about Gregory began to solidify into a horrified certainty that her son was telling the truth. She agreed to stay hidden until after the gala. The final days were a blur of activity. Diana, a whirlwind of efficiency, compiled their evidence into a damning dossier. Milo's notebook copies, Sarah's notarized affidavit, a detailed financial trace of Laneway Productions, linking it directly to luxury purchases and personal investments made by Gregory and Jackson's own meticulously documented observations as John Smith. They also prepared a concise, powerful slideshow presentation. A worrying development, one of the board members Jackson had tentatively trusted suddenly became evasive. Diana suspected he might have gotten cold feet and tipped off Grimwald that Reeve is asking some uncomfortable questions, without revealing the full extent of what Jackson knew or his connection to Milo. It wasn't a full betrayal, but it meant Gregory and Grimwald might be more alert. Jackson, leveraging a discreet personal contact within the NYPD's white-collar crime division, arranged for a plainclothes police presence at the gala. He outlined the potential for significant financial fraud, embezzlement, and witness intimidation, ensuring that if things escalated, official intervention would be swift. The night before the gala, Jackson felt the immense weight of his impending actions. If their plan failed, Gregory and Grimwald would unleash their lawyers, shred their reputations, and the Roxford, his grandfather's legacy, would be irrevocably tainted, likely falling completely under Gregory's corrupt control. Milo, a brave kid who had already endured so much, would be publicly vilified. Jackson barely slept, replaying every step, every contingency, his resolve hardening into a cold, determined anger. The theater's ghostlight, the single bulb traditionally left burning on a dark stage, seemed to mock him with its solitary vigil. Tomorrow he would bring the full glare of floodlights onto the darkness that had infected the Roxford. The Roxford Theater glittered. Chandeliers cast a warm glow over the well-heeled crowd, mingling in the grand foyer, champagne flutes in hand. On a raised dais, Gregory Lane, resplendent in a bespoke tuxedo, was at his most charming, his voice resonating with theatrical sincerity as he spoke of the Roxford's commitment to nurturing young talent. Arthur Grimwald stood beside him, beaming like a proud father, occasionally nodding in agreement. Martha Jenkins hovered nervously in the background. Jackson Reeve, impeccably dressed but radiating a coiled tension, watched from a discreet position near the side of the room. Milo, looking pale but resolute in a borrowed suit that was slightly too big for him, stood by his side. Diana, a reassuring presence, was a few steps away, a slim laptop bag at her feet. Gregory reached the crescendo of his speech. And so it is, with immense pride, that I announce the bold new expansion of our Roxford Youth Talent Fund, a multi-year initiative that will ensure no deserving young artist in this city is left behind. Polite, enthusiastic applause rippled through the room. This was the moment. Jackson stepped forward, his voice clear and carrying easily over the subsiding applause. Mr. Lane, a compelling vision. But perhaps you could first enlighten your generous donors about the current state of the Youth Talent Fund. A hush fell. Heads turned. Gregory, momentarily thrown by the interruption, frowned. He recognized the man speaking, but couldn't quite place him outside of his John Smith context. Then Jackson continued, "For those of you who may not know me, my name is Jackson Reeve. I own this theater." A collective gasp went through the audience. Gregory Lane's suave composure fractured his face, paling visibly. Arthur Grimwald looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. Before Gregory could recover, Diana had connected her laptop to the large projector screen behind the dais, a screen Gregory had intended for his own glossy presentation. Instead of images of smiling children, a stark spreadsheet appeared, showing columns of figures, dates, amounts, and the recipient, Laneway Productions. For the past 3 years, Mr. Lane Jackson continued, his voice devoid of emotion. You, with the assistance of Mr. Grimwald, have systematically embezzled over $700,000 from the Youth Talent Fund. Money intended for children diverted to your personal shell company. Pandemonium threatened. Gregory, recovering his voice, began to bluster. This is an outrage slander. These are baseless accusations from a a disgruntled source. He glared at Jackson, finally making the connection. "You, Smith, this is some kind of vendetta." "My name is Reeve Jackson," corrected calmly, "and the evidence is not baseless." He gestured to Milo. "This young man, Milo Ventura, an intern at this theater, is the one who discovered your other ledger, Mr. Lane, the one you kept off the official books." Milo stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear. He recounted finding the ledger, copying the entries, and the subsequent terrifying confrontation in the prop room where Gregory had tied him up and threatened him. He held up photocopies of his notebook pages, which Diana then projected onto the screen, matching specific entries to withdrawals and transfers benefiting Laneway. Gregory lunged towards the podium microphone, shouting about lies and manipulations. Grimwald was stammering, trying to distance himself, but Jackson wasn't finished. He presented Sarah's sworn affidavit detailing Gregory's earlier financial abuses and threats. He then played a short, damning audio recording captured by Diana during one of Gregory's pressured phone calls to Elena, where Gregory's voice, slick with menace, offered Elena a bribe to silence Milo. The Allied board members, looking grim, stood up one by one in a silent show of support for Jackson. At that moment, several unobtrusive individuals who had been lingering near the exits moved purposefully toward the dais. Detective Miller, Jackson's NYPD contact, identified himself. "Mr. Lane, Mr. Grimwald." Detective Miller said, his voice calm but authoritative. "We need you to come with us to answer some questions regarding allegations of embezzlement, fraud, and witness tampering. And Mr. Lane also regarding the false imprisonment of a minor." Gregory Lane erupted, shouting his innocence, his carefully constructed facade shattering into a million pieces of raw, impotent rage. Grimwald merely sagged, a broken man. The glittering gala had transformed into a crime scene. The immediate aftermath was a maelstrom of flashing cameras, urgent whispers, and stunned disbelief. The Roxford Donor Gala ended not with a standing ovation, but with the quiet click of handcuffs. Jackson remained calm amidst the chaos, speaking briefly to the shocked donors, assuring them of his commitment to transparency and justice. The subsequent investigation was swift and thorough. Milo's notebook, Sarah's testimony, and Diana's meticulous financial tracking provided an irrefutable trail of corruption. Gregory Lane was charged with multiple felonies, his charm useless against the weight of evidence. He was eventually convicted and sentenced to a significant prison term. Arthur Grimwald, facing his own set of charges, cooperated with prosecutors, his career and reputation in ruins. Several other minor players in the scheme were also identified and faced consequences. Martha Jenkins, though not criminally implicated, was dismissed for gross negligence. The Roxford Theater faced an existential crisis. Its reputation was shattered, its finances in disarray. Jackson Reeve, no longer an absentee owner, threw himself into the Herculean task of rebuilding. He dissolved the old board, appointing a new one with stringent oversight. Diana, initially as an interim measure, then more permanently, took on a leading operational role, her sharp intellect and integrity proving invaluable. Elena Ventura, Milo's mother, kept her job at the box office. Jackson personally ensured she was treated with respect and fairness, and within a year, based on her own merits and quiet competence, she was promoted to office manager. Milo, though, hailed in some media reports as a young hero, shied away from the spotlight. The experience had left scars, an indelible mark on his youth. Jackson, understanding this, offered not public adulation, but quiet support, therapy mentorship, and a promise that when Milo was ready, a genuine, meaningful role in the revitalized Roxford's Real Youth program awaited him if he chose it. The heartbreaking aspect wasn't just the crime itself, but the shattering of innocence. Milo's primarily, but also Jackson's own naivety about the institution he had inherited and neglected. It was the betrayal of trust by men his grandfather had respected, the corrosion of art by greed, and the long, arduous path to heal the wounds inflicted on the community and the theater's spirit. Months later, the Roxford, though still finding its footing, was beginning to breathe again. A smaller, genuinely impactful youth workshop was in progress, its participants chosen through a transparent, audited process. Jackson stood at the back of the studio watching Milo, now a volunteer assistant mentor, patiently explaining a stagecraft technique to a group of eager teenagers. There was a new lightness in Milo's eyes, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. As the workshop ended, Jackson walked onto the main stage, now quiet and dark. Save for a single bare bulb on a stand, the ghost light. He touched its warm glass. It was no longer just a tradition, but a symbol of vigilance of the truth brought painstakingly into the light. Milo joined him. "Thank you, Mr. Reeve," Milo said softly, "for not giving up." Jackson put a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Thank you, Milo. You reminded me what the Roxford is truly supposed to be about." They stood in silence for a moment, the single light pushing back the shadows. The road ahead for the Roxford was long, but its foundation, now cleansed, was built on something far stronger than deceit, the courage of a young man and the belated hard-won integrity of its owner. The heartbreak was real, but so was the hope.